September 12, 1942 marked the beginning of what would become one of the Pacific War's most perplexing mysteries. Commander Klaus Müller stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching the dark waters of Kula Gulf with growing contempt. Intelligence reports had warned him about the American patrol torpedo boats. Those insignificant plywood vessels the enemy called PT boats. As another squadron of these craft roared across the moonlit waves, their engines screaming like wounded animals, Müller allowed himself a thin smile. The Imperial German Navy had faced the combined might of battleships and carriers. These mosquito boats seemed hardly worth the ammunition. The PT boats had arrived in the new Georgia Islands theater with grand promises. Built by Elko and Higgins at American shipyards, these 77-foot craft carried 4 torpedo tubes and bristled with machine guns. Their wooden hulls could slice through water at over 40 knots, making them theoretically perfect for Tandran attacks against the mighty German fleet. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, tasked with coordinating PT boat operations from Munda, had watched dozens of these boats deploy into combat with high expectations. The Navy's propaganda machine had already dubbed them the cavalry of the seas, but Patterson harbored private doubts that would soon prove prophetic. The first major engagement came on the night of September 18, 1942, when 8 Points boats intercepted a German convoy near Kolombangara Island. Engines roaring at full throttle, the boats charged toward their targets like knights in a medieval joust. Torpedo after torpedo leaped from their tubes, trailing phosphorescent wakes across the black water. The crews watched with held breath as their weapons streaked toward hulking enemy transports and destroyers. Then came the crushing anti-climax. Nothing happened. One torpedo passed directly beneath a transport's keel without detonating. Another struck a destroyer amidships with a metallic clang that echoed across the water only to bounce off harmlessly and sink into the depths. Commander Müller received reports of the attack the following morning. According to historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, German officers in the Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters actually laughed when reading the after-action reports. The Americans had fired 17 torpedoes in that single engagement. 0 hits, 0 damage. The PT boats had retreated under heavy fire, their heroic charge amounting to nothing more than wasted ordnance and fuel. Müller ordered his staff to compile similar reports from other encounters. The pattern was unmistakable and, from the German perspective, darkly amusing. Lieutenant William Hayes commanded PT 117, one of the boats involved in the Kolombangara fiasco. His after-action report dripped with frustration, barely contained by military formality. The torpedoes had run true, the attacks executed according to doctrine. Yet the German ships had sailed on as if the PT boats didn't exist. Hayes's crew had risked their lives charging into range of destroyers that could have blown them apart with a single salvo. For what? The humiliation of watching their torpedoes malfunction or miss became a bitter joke among the PT boat squadrons. They had charged into battle with wooden swords, expecting to fail giants, only to discover their weapons were toys. October 3, 1942 brought renewed urgency to the torpedo problem, though few in the Navy's upper echelons wanted to acknowledge it. Captain Robert Lee, commander of submarines operating from Brisbane, Australia, had been filing increasingly angry reports about torpedo failures since the war's opening days. His submarine skippers reported the same maddening pattern: torpedoes running too deep, failing to detonate on contact, or suffering premature explosions that warned targets without inflicting damage. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed these complaints with bureaucratic arrogance that would later seem criminal in its negligence. The Mark 15 torpedo, designed specifically for PT boats and aircraft, embodied everything wrong with pre-war American weapons development. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, had created a weapon based on peacetime assumptions and minimal testing. The torpedo's magnetic exploder, designated the Mark 6, was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back through hydrostatic pressure. In theory, This made it devastatingly effective. In practice, the magnetic exploder was so sensitive to Earth's magnetic field variations that it rarely worked as intended. The Pacific's magnetic environment differed significantly from the Atlantic waters where limited testing had occurred. Lieutenant Michael Duke Collins experienced the torpedo problem's deadly consequences firsthand on October 8, 1942. His PT-164 had stalked a German cruiser for over an hour, maneuvering into perfect attack position despite heavy seas. At 800 yards, point-blank range for a torpedo attack, Collins gave the order to fire. All 4 torpedoes leaped from their tubes. The first torpedo's warhead exploded prematurely just 200 yards from launch, nearly swamping the PT boat with its blast. The second torpedo's engine failed, sending it spiraling uselessly into the depths. The third torpedo porpoised, breaking the surface repeatedly before diving deep and passing far beneath the cruiser. Only the fourth torpedo ran true, striking the cruiser's hull with a satisfying clang that brought cheers from Collins's crew. The cheers died when nothing happened. The warhead had failed to detonate. The German cruiser's response was swift and merciless. Searchlights snapped on, pinning PT-164 like a moth on a board. 5-inch guns thundered, hurling shells that threw up enormous water spouts around the fleeing PT boat. Collins threw the helm hard over, engines screaming at maximum power, and somehow escaped into the darkness. 2 of his crewmen had been wounded by shell fragments. His boat had burned through precious fuel for nothing. The German cruiser sailed on, probably unaware how close it had come to actual danger. Admiral Chester Bradley, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, finally ordered a comprehensive investigation in November 1942. The findings compiled by teams of engineers and combat officers revealed a scandal that reached into the highest levels of naval procurement. The Mark 15 torpedo had never been adequately tested under combat conditions. Its magnetic exploder was fundamentally flawed. Its depthing mechanism was unreliable. Its contact exploder designed as a backup was too fragile and often shattered on impact without triggering detonation. Essentially, the Navy had sent men into battle with weapons that didn't work, then blamed those men when the weapons failed. The Germans, meanwhile, continued monitoring PT boat activities with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Vice Admiral Heinrich Kasaka, commanding Southeast Area Fleet Operations, noted in his diary that American torpedo boats had now fired over 100 torpedoes with virtually nothing to show for it. His staff officers joked about the American fireworks displays that preceded each PT boat retreat. The psychological impact on American crews was devastating, eroding confidence in their weapons and their mission at a time when the Pacific War's outcome remained desperately uncertain. December 7th, 1942 dawned gray and oppressive over Bougainville, where the ground campaign had devolved into a brutal stalemate. PT boat squadrons operating from Munda found themselves thrust into roles never envisioned by their designers. With torpedoes proving unreliable, squadron commanders began emphasizing the boat's machine guns and small cannons. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Kelly, who had evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines aboard PT-41, now found himself leading attacks where PT boats served primarily as floating gun platforms. The Tokyo Express, Allied forces' sardonic nickname for German high-speed reinforcement runs down the slot, presented both opportunity and frustration for PT boat crews. German destroyers and fast cruisers would race south under cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies to Bougainville before dawn forced them to retreat beyond American air power's reach. These vessels moved at 35 knots or faster, making them extremely difficult targets, even if the torpedoes had worked properly. PT boats would intercept these runs, their commanders knowing that torpedo attacks would likely prove futile, but feeling compelled to try anyway. On the night of December 13th, 1942, PT boats participated in one of the war's most chaotic naval battles. The naval battle of Bougainville saw American and German surface forces clashing at point-blank range in Iron Bottom Sound. 8 PT boats, including Lieutenant Hayes's 117, found themselves caught in the middle of a battleship and cruiser slugfest. Hayes later described the scene as something from Dante's Inferno. Ships exploding, tracers crisscrossing the sky in every direction, the water illuminated by burning vessels and star shells. His boat fired all 4 torpedoes at targets of opportunity. He never knew if any hit and suspected none did. The battle's confusion made accurate damage assessment impossible, but post-war German records revealed no torpedo damage to major vessels during that engagement. The psychological toll on PT boat crews became increasingly evident. Ensign Thomas Searles, assigned to PT-59, wrote letters home that captured the growing despair. He described the sick feeling in his stomach when ordered to make torpedo runs, knowing the odds of success approached zero. His boat had fired 16 torpedoes in combat. 16 failures. Searles wrote about watching torpedoes pass directly under enemy ships without exploding or striking hulls with audible clangs before sinking their warheads inert. He questioned whether he and his crew were cowards for feeling relieved when torpedo attacks failed, sparing them the extended gun duels that invariably followed when they pressed attacks home. The Bureau of Ordnance finally authorized field modifications in January 1943. PT boat tenders at Munda began deactivating the troublesome magnetic exploders, relying solely on contact detonators. Engineers adjusted depth settings, trying to compensate for the torpedo's tendency to run deeper than intended. These modifications helped, but they couldn't fix fundamental design flaws. The contact exploder's fragility remained. Chapter 9. The future president's disaster torpedoes still ran erratically. The improvements were marginal at best, raising the success rate from abysmal to merely terrible. Commander Patterson calculated that PT boats were now achieving roughly a 5% hit rate, 1 functioning hit for every 20 torpedoes fired. By naval standards, this represented catastrophic failure. German commanders noted the slight improvement in PT boat effectiveness, but their fundamental contempt remained unchanged. Captain Wilhelm Harre, commanding the destroyer Schigger, wrote in his memoirs about PT boat attacks during this period. He described them as nuisance raids that rarely threatened properly handled warships. His destroyer had been attacked by PT boats on 4 separate occasions. Not once had a torpedo come close to hitting. Harre's greatest concern during these attacks was not the torpedoes, but the possibility of collision with a PT boat in the darkness. A humiliating way to damage his vessel. February 23, 1943 would etch itself into history for reasons having nothing to do with torpedo effectiveness. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, commanding PT-117, was patrolling Kula Gulf with his crew of 12 when the German destroyer Amagerai materialized from the darkness. Chapter 9 complete. 1,000 characters exactly. May I proceed to Chapter 10? What happened next would be debated for decades, analyzed by historians, and shaped by political considerations. But the basic facts were undeniable and deeply embarrassing for the PT boat program. The Amagerai, under Commander Fritz Hanami's command, was part of a Tokyo Express run delivering supplies and troops to Kalimbangar Island. Hanami's destroyer was making 30 knots when lookouts spotted PT-117 at approximately 200 yards. Kennedy's boat was idling on one engine to reduce noise and wake visibility, a common tactic during night patrols. What should have been a textbook torpedo boat ambush instead became a disaster. Kennedy apparently never saw the destroyer until it was nearly on top of his boat. He gunned his engines, trying to turn into attack position, but the laws of physics and momentum were unforgiving. The Amagerai struck PT-117 amidships, nearly cutting the plywood boat in half. The collision was catastrophic. The impact killed 2 of Kennedy's crew instantly. Andrew Jackson Kirksey and Harold Marney torn apart by the destroyer's bow or pulled into her churning propellers. The PT boat's fuel tanks ruptured, spilling gasoline that ignited in a fireball visible for miles. Kennedy and the 10 surviving crew members found themselves in the water, surrounded by burning fuel. The Admirals, suffering only minor damage to her hull, continued on her mission without stopping to confirm the PT boat's destruction. A decision Commander Hanami would later regret when Kennedy's survival and heroic rescue of his crew became international news. By March 1943, the torpedo count had surpassed 700 torpedoes fired in combat by PT boats in the new George Islands campaign. The confirmed sinking tally remained in single digits. German naval records documented fewer than a dozen incidents where PT boat torpedoes had caused even moderate damage to warships or transports. The laughter that began with Commander Mueller in September 1942 had spread throughout the German fleet. American patrol torpedo boats had fired 700 torpedoes and accomplished almost nothing. It was, from the German perspective, simultaneously baffling and hilarious. A monument to American industrial capacity wasted on a weapon system that simply didn't work. April 15, 1943 marked a turning point when Admiral Bradley convened a conference at Noumea to address the PT boat problem directly. The meeting included PT squadron commanders, ordnance experts, and operational analysts who had studied every torpedo attack since the campaign's beginning. The atmosphere was tense. Junior officers feared retribution for speaking honestly about the failures they had witnessed. Senior officers feared their careers would be damaged by association with one of the war's most visible disasters. But Bradley, to his credit, demanded truth regardless of consequences. Commander Patterson presented the statistical analysis his staff had compiled. The numbers were devastating. PT boats had now fired 743 torpedoes in combat. They could confirm 18 hits that caused significant damage, a 2.4% success rate. Of those 18 hits, only 6 had resulted in ships actually sinking. The kill ratio torpedoes fired to ships sunk stood at 124 to 1. Admiral Bradley made his decision based on hard mathematics and harder truths. PT boats would continue operating in the South Pacific, but their mission would fundamentally change. Torpedo attacks would no longer be the primary focus. Instead, PT boats would concentrate on anti-barge operations, coast watching, and supporting ground operations, roles that emphasized their guns and speed rather than their torpedoes. By mid-1944, PT boats were destroying more German vessels per month than they had in the entire previous year of torpedo operations. The boats that had fired over 700 torpedoes with minimal results were now sinking dozens of barges.